So literature was seen as a springboard for reading programs.
It was indeed. Literature-based programs became a very big thing through the next 2 decades of the 80s and the 90s, but it was also seen as a foundation for research and reading of factual texts, so it became a springboard for that kind of work as well. So it was a true point of integration in the classroom and worked really well in that way. But at the same time, as always in education, there was a critique of what was happening because this unexamined view was just going into the classroom through the literature and teachers were not looking at what were the authors saying in their literary texts. Now remember, this is the 1980s and the whole world was really questioning what was happening in terms of voices from the margins coming to the forward. And in Australia, we had a lot of protests around the environment. There was work around land rights, particularly around 1988, towards the end of the 80s, and a very strong multiculturalism was coming to the fore. So voices from the margins were coming forward. And what was feared was that what children were getting was really the voice of the middle class and the ideologies of the middle class, because they're the people who produce literature and literary texts for young people. And so if there wasn't a critique of these messages that are implicit in the text, then essentially literature was becoming a major socialisation practice into the ideology of the middle class. And so there were some concerns about this from people who thought seriously about the way they wanted their young readers and young students to become citizens of the future Australia. So this critique is Hollindale's third level of ideology. And it points to the fact that language and meaning are inseparable, that language holds meaning, holds belief systems, and it can be very insidious in the way that meanings are presented in language because it's not obvious. Bakhtin's writings around the dialogic potential of language are very helpful to us here because he sees language as a dialogue, not a dialogue like you and I are having, but a dialogue within itself. And so that notion of the meaning potential is always present. NAPLAN is a good example of that. NAPLAN does mean different things to different people. And it is a site of struggle for meaning as well. And so both those ideas are present in this notion of dialogic potential of language. Language is not neutral, it never can be neutral. And it always means different things to different people and different social groups. So this was the idea that comes to the fore in Hollindale's third level of ideology, which is this notion of critical literacy. And that's how critical literacy came forward as we moved into the 90s. So what this critical shift reminds us of is the power of literature in the classroom. Because when literature is used in the classroom, it is given authority. It is the piece that is authorised by the school, by the education system, certainly by the teacher. And we have to be aware of this because then that leads to us understanding how what it says inscribes young readers in its meanings. And so it's very important to recognise that added power. And so when students are able to be guided to look at the hidden meanings that are in the text, then the power of the literature across ways of thinking becomes something that can be negotiated. A good example of this is Julie O'Brien's study from the 90s where she worked with kindergarten children and they looked at Mother's Day advertisements and Mother's Day cards and were able to interrogate the meanings that were there in terms of, is this how my mother is? What do they want me to think about mums through these texts? And so, although they weren't literary texts, they were certainly texts that were able to be interrogated by young students.
You've helped us understand the importance of critical reading. Now, how does the Australian curriculum present that to us?
The Australian curriculum does it through context, which is the first of the sub-strands that go across the 3 vertical strands. So it's the horizontal strand. And context looks very carefully at how meanings are made. And in literature, it particularly looks at the historical contexts, the social contexts, the cultural contexts that are present in literary texts. And so they can be mined for what is evident from history in the text, in the way the characters act, in the plot, in the events, in the themes, in the language. Similarly, what cultural aspects are there, what social aspects are there. And so it is very important in the Australian curriculum, and it's seen as actually the first cut that we do across the three strands of language, literature and literacy. That leads us into feminist research of children's literature, which also became very important once the notion of critical reading came through, and the idea in the 90s of looking at the meanings that lie in texts and that may not be so obvious. Feminist research showed that, unsurprisingly, there's a male bias in the reading texts in the classroom, and that male activities are privileged over female activities, and females are often seen as, guess what, situated in the home, as marriage being important, domesticity generally being important, and quite passive in terms of their roles. As well, feminist research of children's literature highlighted that it really was significant in the way that young females, whether they're in primary school or high school, saw themselves. So the notion of identity construction is also present there. And so if they're being given very passive views of themselves, this has been taken on. Now, even when non-sexist books supposedly were looked at, the non-sexist stories showed that girls were able to take on some male characteristics, but there were very few instances of boys, of males, taking on what could be seen as feminine characteristics. And that can just mean gentleness, it can mean cooperation, it can mean allowing someone else to take over and not be dominant within a group of peers. So it's just interesting to see how current research is showing that there are still some things that haven't changed.
So, Lorraine, you're pointing to the fact that teachers' selection of children's books is important.
It is. Teachers need to consider the ways of thinking that the books they select present, and that means their selection of text is very important. 2 decades ago, the typical criteria, research tells us, for teachers' selection of children's literature is what is quality literature and what is popular with children, what do children prefer. These days, they've been guided and continue to be guided by the Children's Book Awards, and they're often a good way of thinking about teachers of quality. But also, research has shown, your research in fact, amongst others, Robin, that teachers' selection of texts that they use more frequently in the classroom is really a kind of tested, tried and true selection from their own past. Sometimes books they had as children, sometimes books that they covered at university when they were studying, and they really haven't gone past that. Now, there's nothing wrong with those texts, and often they're very good quality texts, but it's very good to move on and pick up on new authors and to show current ways of thinking that are present and aware of how current texts are being written and the kinds of topics that they raise. Now, the other thing I think about teacher selection is that Peter has really been responsible here. Peter has got a bunch of resources, excellent resources it's put up for working with the Children's Book Council Awards, and it has taken its responsibility very seriously here. Yet there are dangers here. The New South Wales syllabus for the Australian curriculum has a list of prescribed texts, which are very good quality texts, but there is a problem in that teachers may well only draw on those texts and not explore others for themselves. And there's a possibility, which I hope doesn't happen, that the Australian Curriculum English may lead publishers to ask authors to write stories that would fit in with their frameworks, which would essentially be a set of basal readers with a little bit of a literary slant. So there is a problem that either of those things or some other things could evolve from this.
So how does the focus on language fit into the teaching of children's literature?
Language fits in through a text-based approach. There's been a big push around the teaching of language as various linguists and educational researchers believed that we needed a theory of language to underpin the teaching of literacy. And this has been very useful for us because the model that's been developed and has evolved in classrooms has been a functional model of language, which offers us a meaning base for how language constructs meaning, how the grammar of the language constructs the semantic meaning of the text. And so that text-based approach has been used with a focus on writing, but it's also been used with a focus on reading and a focus on looking at how texts are put together. And what's important here is how Peter has really pioneered this area. Its texts are seminal in the way that it has looked at language. It has presented the theory of language in very accessible ways for teachers. Bev Derivianka is a name known across Australia, as well as across the world, I might add, in terms of the way that she has been able to present, and she's written for Peter several outstanding texts in this area. There hasn't been a lot of work on the language in relation to literature as much as there has been in relation to writing. But my own doctoral research looked at that relationship between a theory of language, how language is realised in the construction of a literary text, and working with fifth graders to come to some understanding of how that creates meaning in the text. The explicit teaching of language has led us to the notion of scaffolding, which has become a major teaching strategy in the teaching of writing and language in classrooms. Now, that also can be directed to the teaching of literature, because what we need to recognise too, and is often unacknowledged, is that the teacher scaffolds the literature for students. The teacher is the mediator between the written text and what students are thinking about the text. There is the notion of a running commentary that teachers do, where they kind of filter the meanings of the text through to the students. And this is interesting because the questions that teachers ask really shape the text. And obviously we can't cover everything in a text, in a children's literature novel particularly, but even in a picture book there's nuances in terms of the images. And so teachers do have to select. They do ignore and they do emphasise different parts. So this scaffolding that happens in writing also happens in reading in ways that perhaps aren't as obvious as sometimes needs to be.
So these teacher questions are important?
Yes, indeed. They shape the text. And in doing so, they can also give entry to various literacy tasks of reading, obviously, talking, again, obviously, listening with talking, and viewing as well. And viewing is one of the new areas that have come forward. We've always had them with picture books, of course, but now picture books are seen as our first multimodal texts, where we use more than one mode, not just print, but print and images. And they've come to the fore. And there's been various ways of looking at images that have come out as well that teachers are beginning to use in classrooms. So what's important is how authors and illustrators' work has now become an accepted part of literacy learning, and the work that illustrators do is beginning to be analysed and looked at, and how it makes meaning along in combination with the print is an important aspect. And I want to finish this section by thinking about authors and how authors' work in classrooms is becoming to the fore, and that's something that has shifted, I think, in the way that we work with authors these days. Because they do come in, they have writing workshops, they often are part of an author study. Peter introduced that with Ivan Southall way back at the beginning, and we've had Libby Gleeson writing for Peter. And Libby is one of my favourite authors. She's an award-winning Australian author and really works with characters and shows us characters in her thoughts. And she also works with very controversial topics as well.